Hello, everybody. For chapter 22, we're going to be talking about humans and the environment. In this first part, we're going to be looking at different parts of our environment and some ways that we impact those different parts of the environment. To start off, environmental science is the study of the interactions between humans and their own environment. So that's going to be the big focus. We see two pictures here that represent different ways we can impact the environment. We can talk about some of the bad impacts we can have on the environment, such as the pollution being shown in those smokestacks to the left. We can also talk about some of the positive impacts we can have on the environment, such as maybe planting new trees, new plants, protecting different types of organisms and different types of habitats. So those are some things we'll be discussing as we move throughout this chapter. The Earth is very, very large. So when we talk about it, it's important to know that there are different layers of Earth, and sometimes those layers interact. For example, the Earth's geosphere, which is the land, the hydrosphere, which is the water, and the atmosphere, which is, of course, the gas that surrounds Earth. They are all interconnected in many ways. We'll be talking about that in a moment. Together, these parts make up the biosphere, which is the part of Earth where life exists. That's something that we've talked about this year already. The biosphere is anywhere on Earth where life exists. So the geosphere is the Earth's rock interior that extends from the molten center of the planet's core to the solid surface of the crust. So you might have before learned about some of these layers of the geosphere, talking about maybe volcanic activity, maybe earthquakes. The geosphere exchanges materials with the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. Some of the ways that the geosphere exchanges materials is through erosion. So rock and soil gets broken down and gets spread throughout the rest of the layers of the Earth. Volcanic activity shoots gas and different types of materials from the geosphere up into the atmosphere. So the geosphere is very, very important because it connects to all of the other layers of the Earth. The geosphere also contains many of the Earth's natural resources that we use, such as coal and oil. Almost everything that you have today, your cell phones, your computers, any materials that are made, there's a really good chance that oil, in one way or another, was used to make it. Of course, we know oil is also really important for our cars and different types of machines. And coal is still really important today because it's one of the main sources that we burn to create electricity still. So even though these different resources are being used up and they're not renewable, there's still a lot of them being used today. And the burning of those things can impact our environment. The hydrosphere is the portion of Earth that is water. This includes all of the oceans, lakes, rivers, your streams, ponds. That's all included in your hydrosphere. About 70% of the Earth is covered by water. So we have a tremendous amount of water that covers Earth. That's one of the things that makes our planet really special and allows life to exist here. Of the water that exists on Earth, only about 3% of the water on Earth is fresh water. So only 3% of that water is actually water that we could drink. However, the 3% that's fresh water, most of it is tied up and frozen in glaciers. So only about 1% of our fresh water actually exists in a liquid form that we can drink. So that's really important to think about. There's only a certain amount of water that we have on Earth that is fresh water that's drinkable. This is why it's really important to protect the water supply that we have to make sure it does not become polluted, damaged, or wasted. There's more and more, humans on Earth and kind of the same amount of water. So this is a concern that we might have in the future if we start to run out of water. The atmosphere is the mixture of gases that surrounds the Earth. In our picture on this slide, you can see above the Earth that sort of light blue, whitish line that surrounds the Earth. That is some of the gases that make up our atmosphere. In our atmosphere, about 78% of it is nitrogen gas. When we breathe in the air, we often think that, oh, we're breathing in only oxygen. Actually, you're breathing in a mixture of gases. 21% of the air that you're breathing in is oxygen, and that's the gas that we use in our body, but you also breathe in other gases that your body either might use a little bit or they might kind of filter out and get rid of. But 21% is the amount of oxygen that we have in our atmosphere right now. Also, our atmosphere contains the ozone layer, which is a very important part of our atmosphere. It's a mixture of gases that help protect us from the sun's harmful rays. We'll talk a little bit more about ozone in just a moment. The ozone layer is the layer of the atmosphere which absorbs ultraviolet solar radiation from the sun. So in our picture over towards the right, we see that the sun emits a large amount of different UV rays. And our ozone actually helps filter and block a lot of those harmful rays. These are the rays from the sun. This is the radiation that burns you when you get too much of it, and can also lead to skin cancer. We can see that the ozone blocks out a lot of the strong UVB rays. Only a little bit makes it through, but it doesn't block out a lot of the weaker UVA rays, which can still end up damaging your skin over a long period of time. So this is why it's important when you're outside to wear sunscreen. That radiation that comes down from the sun can still damage your skin, especially if you get sunburned. That is, damage to your skin. And evidence shows that repeated damage to your skin from this radiation can actually lead to skin cancer. So having sunscreen on when you're outside is something that maybe we don't think about all the time, but it's something that we should be more cautious about. It's something that we should take more time and take more care to do if you want to care for your skin, which is, of course, the biggest organ that you have. Some gases in our atmosphere, they radiate or bounce back heat energy towards Earth's surface. The atmosphere's ability to trap heat in this way is called the greenhouse effect. Gases that contribute to the greenhouse effect include carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. So when you hear about the greenhouse effect, it's basically like this blanket of gases in our atmosphere that kind of trap heat. They bounce heat back down towards Earth. And we need some of the greenhouse effect to keep Earth at a warm temperature that supports life. If we didn't have any greenhouse effect, if we didn't have any greenhouse gases, Earth would be a frozen ice ball. It would be way too cold because all of the heat energy that would hit Earth would bounce back and leave the atmosphere, and we wouldn't keep any of that heat, and we would be frozen. So we do want some greenhouse effect on Earth. However, it's become clear that in the past 100 years or so, by putting different gases like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have increased this greenhouse effect, and we have trapped more heat than we need. And this is warming the Earth up, and this is what's changing our climate. This is what's changing our weather patterns. This is what's melting the glaciers on Earth. We have this increased greenhouse effect. This diagram shows us what the greenhouse effect looks like. The yellow arrows coming from the left shows the solar energy that's coming down from the sun. The sun and the warmth that shines down on you when you're outside comes down through our atmosphere and hits Earth. Now, when it hits Earth, a lot of it gets reflected back up into the atmosphere. That's what's being shown by our first set of red arrows. It gets reflected back up. And it goes through this layer of gases, and some of those gases act to bounce that heat energy back down towards Earth. So we can see that some of the heat energy gets bounced back and it leaves the atmosphere, goes back away from Earth, but some of it gets bounced back down towards Earth, keeping the heat and energy in our atmosphere and on our planet. So like I said, we do want some of this to happen if we want our Earth to remain the temperature that it is. We don't want it to be a frozen ice ball. That would not support life on Earth as we know it. However, with the increased amount of carbon dioxide that we've been putting into the atmosphere, too much heat and energy is getting trapped in our atmosphere. And we're warming up too much. We're trapping too much heat, and that's causing big changes to happen on our planet. So the concentrations of greenhouse gases affect the amount of the sun's heat that is trapped by the atmosphere. If we put more CO2 into the atmosphere, more heat is trapped, more energy is trapped, and this warms the earth. This is what you guys learned about in your climate report last week. We talked about how the climate is changing, how it's warming up, and how it's affecting not only our weather patterns, but nearly everything else on Earth. It's impacting life in tons of ways that we don't even think about. So humans, we're adding additional carbon dioxide, additional CO2 into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels. We send a tremendous amount up into the atmosphere every day. If you were able to see this gas, remember, it's clear, you can't see it, but if you were, it would be unbelievable the amount of gas you would see going up from cars, from factories, from many of the things that we do on Earth that burn these fossil fuels. When we talk about the environment and our impacts on the environment, we also talk about how we affect biodiversity. Biodiversity is something we talked about throughout this year. That is the variety of forms of life in an area. So for example, the tropical rainforest has a huge amount of biodiversity. It has a lot more biodiversity than we have in our area. However, when we look at biodiversity overall on Earth, right now it looks like it's decreasing because a lot of the changes that are happening to the environment are causing certain species to go extinct. We're losing species at a very quick rate. There's actually a lot of evidence that shows that we are in the beginning of a mass extinction on Earth for many of our species. They can't deal with some of the changes that are happening in terms of pollution. The air and the water in some areas are getting too dirty for different organisms. The changing of the climate. We said that some areas are changing so much that they can no longer support the types of things that live there. Some tropical areas are becoming dry and turning into deserts. The organisms in those areas can't live there. The oceans are a big concern. The oceans are becoming warmer and they're becoming more acidic. So many of the things that are sensitive in the ocean, a lot of the corals, a lot of the fish, they can't deal with those changes very well. So we're seeing their numbers start to drop. Habitat loss is another thing too. Cutting down rainforests, destroying habitats, that has wiped out a lot of species. So unfortunately, it looks like our biodiversity is in trouble right now. We're losing a lot of different species on Earth. There is a couple ways to measure biodiversity. One way to do this is by looking at species diversity, such as species richness. That is the number of unique species in an area. So the more different species you have in an area, the higher the species richness is for that area. Species evenness refers to the relative abundance of each species. So you might look at the species evenness of a place and see that all of the numbers of different species are pretty similar. Or you might look and say in this area that there are a lot more birds or insects than there are mammals in an area. So species evenness kind of compares the numbers of different species to each other. Another way to measure biodiversity is genetic diversity. Genetic diversity refers to the amount of variation or differences in the genetic material within members of a population. This is important because genetic diversity affects the population's ability to adapt in the face of environmental change. So we talked about why it's important to have really diverse populations. We don't want a population of organisms to be all exactly alike if you want them to be able to adapt to changes. The more differences you have in a population, the more there is for natural selection to select upon when the environment changes. And there's more choices. Some of those traits, some of those genes in a population are going to be better suited for survival than others. An example we talked about was cheetahs. Their population is pretty small, and they don't have a lot of genetic diversity in their population. So they're not going to be as well adapted for environmental changes as maybe a certain species of insect is that maybe has a lot more genetic differences in their population. So the more genetic diversity a population has, it usually means that they're going to have a better chance of surviving when the environment starts to change. Here is just an example of a biodiversity web, very similar to the food webs that we worked with earlier in the year. This just shows us how all the different things that live in an area are connected to each other in some way. We don't really want to lose any species most of the time, because even though a species might not seem important to us, it might be important to something else in that environment, and it kind of starts a domino effect where you knock down one domino and all the other dominoes start to get knocked down and affected as well. Sort of like a house of cards. Like if you build a house of cards and then you start taking a card out of that structure that you've built, it becomes weaker and might collapse the whole thing. That's what we're looking at here. The more species we lose, the more connections and support we lose in our biosphere. And the more those things eventually will affect us. So we have to look out for all species on Earth to make sure that we're not driving them towards extinction, because eventually that will be affecting us, and it already is in many areas on Earth. Scientists estimate that there may be as many as 100 million different species on Earth. I'm not talking about 100 million total organisms. I'm talking about 100 million different species. So for example, we are one of those species. The entire human species, there's almost 8 billion of us. That counts as one of the 100 million or so different species that exist on Earth. Knowledge of smaller organisms and organisms in extreme or remote isolated locations is poor. So we don't really know how many different species there are on Earth, because we keep on discovering new ones all the time. And the ones that are hard to discover, the ones that are small or the ones that are in areas where we can't get to easily, those are going to be species that we might not find before they even go extinct. We might end up finding fossils of them one day, or you might never come across them at all. So that's pretty interesting to think about. There's still a lot to learn about the different species we have here on Earth.